Welcome to this peaceful moment. Here, you will discover stories inspired by the quiet beauty of Japan. Each tale is like a soft breeze through a bamboo grove, carrying you away from the worries of the day. Imagine the scent of blooming cherry blossoms and the gentle flow of a nearby clear stream. Let these words and sounds cradle your mind in calm and serenity. Tonight, permit yourself to drift into a restful sleep. Let us begin this journey together. The gentle song of falling leaves. The path into the forest was narrow, covered in a carpet of gold and crimson. The leaves had been falling for days, drifting in slow spirals from the high branches. Each one turning in the air as if reluctant to leave its place in the canopy. Aya walked slowly, the hem of her long coat brushing over the leaves. The air was crisp, touched by the faint sweetness of persimmons ripening in a nearby grove. Somewhere far above, the wind moved gently through the trees, setting the remaining leaves to a faint rustling that was almost music. She had not walked this path in years. Life had pulled her away, as it does to so many, from the town where she was born, from the people who had shaped her earliest memories, from the forest that had been her refuge as a child. She had come back now, not for nostalgia, but because she had received a letter written in the fragile, deliberate handwriting of her grandmother. The letter had been short: "The trees are waiting. Come before the last leaves fall." Aya could still hear her grandmother's voice in those words. It was the same voice that had once read her poems by lamplight. The same voice that taught her to listen for the song in the forest, the way leaves and wind spoke together. The deeper Aya walked into the woods, the more she began to hear it again, that quiet song. It wasn't quite a melody, more like a weaving of sounds, the faint swish of leaves brushing against one another. The occasional sigh of wind, the gentle tap of a branch releasing its burden to the ground. She reached the small clearing she remembered from her childhood. In the center stood a weathered bench, carved from cedar, smoothed by decades of rain and sun. Her grandmother sat there, wrapped in a shawl the color of faded rose petals. She looked older, but her eyes were unchanged, clear and still, reflecting the same autumn light Aya remembered. "You came," her grandmother said, smiling. "You asked me to." Her grandmother patted the bench beside her. Aya sat, and for a while they said nothing. The silence was not empty, it was filled with the soft rain of leaves falling around them, landing on their shoulders, their laps, the earth at their feet. "Do you remember what I told you when you were little?" her grandmother asked at last. Aya nodded. That every leaf has its song. And that if you listen long enough, you can hear the forest's story. Not the story written in books, but the one carried in the wind, in the sound of branches moving, in the way the sunlight shifts. Aya closed her eyes. She let the sounds flow together: the rustle of the canopy, the occasional bird call, the gentle scrape of a leaf across the wooden bench. And in that moment, she heard it, a slow, steady rhythm, like breathing. It felt alive, as if the forest itself were exhaling into the air between them. "When I was your age," her grandmother said, "I would come here in the autumn to remind myself of certain things, that endings can be gentle. That beauty does not vanish when it falls, and that even in stillness, there is a kind of music." Aya opened her eyes. "Is that why you wanted me to come now?" Her grandmother looked toward the trees. A gust of wind passed through, sending a flurry of gold into the air. "Because I am like these leaves, Aya. My season is ending. But I want you to understand that there is no sadness in it for me. I wanted you to hear this song while I am still here to share it with you." Aya felt a knot in her chest loosen, but it was replaced with something heavier, the awareness of time's quiet passage. She reached for her grandmother's hand, holding it between her own. They stayed until the sun dipped low, the light turning the forest into a world of fire and shadow. By the time they rose to leave, the bench was covered in leaves. At the edge of the forest, Aya turned back one last time. A single leaf broke free from a high branch, drifting down in slow circles. She listened, and in its fall, she thought she heard the faintest note of that gentle song, the same one she would carry with her long after the season passed. Between shadows and petals, the path wound gently through the old temple garden, where the late spring sun poured its gold through a drifting haze of petals. Cherry blossoms were at their final breath, each soft gust carried away a few more, sending them to swirl and fall upon the moss and stone. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, incense, and something bittersweet, as though the season itself knew its time was almost done. Aya stepped carefully along the stepping stones, her straw sandals brushing against the hem of her pale blue kimono. The temple grounds were quiet, except for the low murmur of the wind and the distant tap of water in the stone basin. She had not been here for many years, not since the day she had stood under the blossoms with someone who now existed only in her memory. That day had been full of laughter, the air thick with petals and promises. She and Haru had walked the same path, fingers brushing but never quite touching, speaking of the future as if it were a garden they could plant together. But the seasons had shifted, as they always do, and time had pulled them apart. Haru had gone to the city, and she had stayed, keeping the garden company through its quiet changes. She came now for a reason she did not fully name. Perhaps it was to remember, to let go. The blossom's shadow patterns danced across her face as she passed beneath the boughs, the sunlight filtering through in shifting fragments. Each step seemed to take her not only forward but also back into the corridors of years. At the garden's heart stood a weathered stone bench, worn smooth by countless seasons. Aya sat there, her hands folded in her lap, and watched petals drift down to gather in the rippling pond. In the reflection, shadows of branches tangled with falling pink, two worlds meeting for only a breath before the surface shifted. From somewhere unseen, the temple bell chimed, its deep sound folding into the quiet like an old friend's voice. Aya closed her eyes and listened, letting the resonance carry her back. She could almost hear Haru's footsteps approaching over the gravel, almost feel the weight of the glance they had shared when words were too heavy. When she opened her eyes again, a single petal had landed on her sleeve. It lay there, trembling lightly in the breeze. She lifted it with careful fingers and let it fall into the pond, watching it float away toward the far bank where the shadows grew thick. An elderly monk passed nearby, his robes whispering over the stones. He paused and inclined his head toward her. "The petals fall, yet the branches remain," he said simply, before continuing his slow walk. Aya understood not fully in words, but in the quiet space the thought left behind. As the sun lowered, the light shifted to a deeper gold. Shadows lengthened across the garden, mingling with the soft carpet of petals until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Aya rose, brushing the folds of her kimono, and began the walk back toward the gate. At the final turn of the path, she glanced over her shoulder. The garden lay in its gentle twilight, petals still falling, shadows still moving. Somewhere between those two, between what drifts away and what quietly remains, she felt her own heart settle. The wind carried the last bell's echo toward her, and for the first time in years, she let it go without holding on. Harmony in the stillness of dawn. The night was retreating, slow and deliberate, as though reluctant to surrender to the day. Above the sloping roofs of the mountain village, a pale silver light gathered along the horizon, painting the ridge lines with a soft glow. The air was cool and tasted faintly of pine resin, and the sound of the river was still half hidden in darkness. Akira rose before the rooster's call, as he always did when sleep abandoned him. It had been weeks since his return to the village, weeks of waking to the silence that only the mountains could hold. He slid open the shoji and stepped onto the ingawa. The wooden planks were cool beneath his bare feet. Mist floated just above the garden pond, curling around the stones like white silk threads. The garden itself had been his father's work, meticulously arranged pines, azaleas. A single cherry tree that leaned toward the water as though drawn to its reflection. Akira's father had passed away the winter before, leaving the house and its grounds in Akira's hands. At first, he had returned only to put affairs in order, but the longer he stayed, the harder it was to leave. The city's noise now felt like a dream that had been too loud, too fast. From beyond the garden, the first sound of the morning came, the low, measured beat of a temple bell. The note was deep, resonating through the mist like a stone dropped into still water. Akira paused, letting it seep into him. His father used to say that the bell was not rung to wake the village, but to wake the heart. He crossed the garden to the narrow path that led down toward the river. Pebbles crunched under his feet, mingling with the faint hiss of wind passing through pine needles. The world was still half asleep. Here and there, he caught the murmur of a stream, the rustle of a bird shifting in its nest. The quiet was not empty, it was alive with a kind of unseen presence. As he walked, the eastern sky opened wider. Light spilled through the branches in long, slanted beams. The air carried the scent of damp earth and camellia blossoms. It was the hour his father had always loved most, when the world's edges were blurred and time itself felt suspended. At the river bank, Akira crouched beside the water. A thin skin of mist clung to the surface, drifting in slow patterns that mirrored the shapes of clouds above. He remembered sitting in this same spot as a boy, throwing pebbles and watching the ripples race each other. His father would sit behind him, silent except to point out the way the current curved around rocks, or how the shadow of a pine made the water look deeper than it was. Those mornings had seemed endless then, their quiet a given. Now, they felt fragile, like porcelain, something that could be lost with a careless hand. From upstream came a sound, a faint splash. Akira looked up to see an old man in a conical straw hat standing knee-deep in the water. He moved slowly, lifting a bamboo basket from the current. Fish glinted briefly before disappearing into its shadow. The man turned, saw Akira, and raised a hand in greeting. Akira returned it without words. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge, but the light was stronger now, drawing silver threads along the ripples. Akira stood, brushing his hands together, and began the walk back toward the house. Along the way, he passed the old stone steps that led up to the temple. They were worn smooth by centuries of feet, and small weeds grew in the cracks. Something in him, perhaps the bell's lingering note, drew him upward. The climb was slow. Moss lined the steps, and the air grew cooler as the path wound through tall cedars. At the top, the temple stood quiet, its wooden beams darkened by rain and sun. The bell hung beneath the eaves, still swaying slightly from its morning call. Akira approached it. His father had often rung this bell when the head monk was away. He had shown Akira the way to pull the heavy beam, how to let its weight do the work rather than forcing it. "It's not about making noise," his father had said. "It's about letting the sound become part of the morning." He touched the rope. The fibers were rough against his skin, and for a moment, he hesitated. Then he stepped back, let the beam swing, and felt the deep vibration run through his chest. The sound rolled out over the trees, into the valley, across the roofs of the sleeping village. When the echo faded, there was a deeper silence than before, not an absence of sound, but a fullness, as if the air itself were listening. He remained there for a while, watching as the sun finally rose above the ridge, setting the mist aglow. The valley shifted in color, shadows retreating, pine needles flashing green. Somewhere far below, the old fisherman was likely making his way home, his basket heavy. Akira knew he could not stay here forever. The city still waited, with its obligations and noise. But in that stillness, he also understood that the harmony he felt now was not bound to this place alone. His father's lessons, the quiet of the garden, the bell's deep voice, all of it could be carried within him. When he descended the steps and walked back toward the house, the mist had almost gone. Only a few wisps lingered in the corners of the pond, drifting like the final traces of a dream. Akira paused on the Ngawa before going inside, letting the warmth of the new sun rest on his face. In the stillness of dawn, he thought, there was no separation between past and present, between himself and the world. Everything was woven together, like threads in a single, unbroken cloth. And if he listened closely, he could still hear the bell, resonating softly within him. Lantern light over quiet waters. The summer festival always began quietly in this small lakeside village. No loud music, no hurried crowds, only the patient hum of cicadas and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the water's skin. At the far edge of the lake, where the reeds swayed with the gentlest touch of wind, preparations were nearly complete. Lanterns, pale and round like moons, rested on a long wooden dock, waiting for night to fall. Aya knelt by the dock, tightening the strings of paper and bamboo that held each lantern's frame. Her grandmother sat a few steps away, sewing a strip of faded indigo cloth, its surface scattered with the outlines of maple leaves. From time to time, she would look up from her work and smile, as if making sure Aya remembered the rhythm of this tradition, not just the motions, but the quiet in which they were done. When Aya was a child, her grandmother had told her the story behind the festival. The lanterns were for those who had crossed the invisible river between this world and the next. They would drift upon the lake, carrying prayers, memories, and unspoken words. By the time dawn came, they would be gone, taken, her grandmother said, by the spirits who had been listening all night. The sun slid lower, and shadows grew long across the lake's surface. Villagers began arriving in twos and threes, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Each brought a lantern they had made or decorated themselves, each one unique. A boy carried one painted with a dragonfly, a woman held one brushed with strokes of crimson and gold. Aya's lantern was painted in muted tones, water ripples and the faint outline of a pine tree, like the one outside her grandmother's house. As twilight settled, the first lanterns were lit. The warm glow from their interiors seemed to melt into the air, mixing with the last rays of day. Aya held hers carefully, feeling the faint heat of the candle within. Her grandmother, slower now but still steady, lit her own a plain white lantern, its only decoration a single, hand-painted crescent moon. They stepped together onto the dock. The boards creaked beneath their feet, and the lake lapped gently at the wood. The first lanterns were lowered into the water, where they rocked once, then drifted away, their reflections trembling in the ripples. One by one, more followed, until the darkening lake was scattered with points of amber light. Aya knelt at the edge, holding her lantern just above the water. She hesitated. Her father had died last winter, after an illness that left him thinner and quieter with each passing week. She had not been able to say goodbye in the way she wanted. Words had caught in her throat. Time had felt both too short and unbearably long. Now, she felt that same catch in her chest. Her grandmother's hand came to rest on her shoulder. "Let it go," she whispered. "The water will carry what you can't." Aya closed her eyes, lowered the lantern into the lake, and released it. It drifted forward slowly, almost reluctantly, before joining the current. Its light shimmered, a small golden flame against the deep blue of the night. She imagined her words unspoken, unfinished, slipping into the water, weaving themselves between reeds and stones, rising toward the other shore. The night deepened. The lanterns stretched into the distance, a constellation fallen to earth. From the far side of the lake, faint voices began to sing an old song. Its melody was simple, a repeating rise and fall, like the lap of the water against the dock. Aya did not know all the words, but she hummed along, feeling the vibration in her chest. Somewhere above, the moon lifted itself over the mountains, its pale light mingling with the gold of the lanterns. The water, so still in the afternoon, now seemed to breathe, drawing each light farther into its heart. Aya thought she could see the outline of the far shore, though she knew it was just mist. Her grandmother rose slowly, brushing dust from her kimono. "It's time to walk," she said. They followed the path along the lake, the lanterns always to their left, drifting beside them. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of lilies. Crickets sang from the grass, their rhythm answering the quiet splash of water against the bank. Aya felt the stillness settle into her, a stillness not empty but full of memory, of breath, of something she could not name. When they reached the narrow pier on the other side, they stopped. The last of the villagers gathered there, watching the lanterns float past. By now the wind had picked up, and the lights moved more quickly, as if hurrying towards something unseen. Aya's lantern passed close to the pier, its small flame flickering. She leaned forward slightly, as though to follow it, but it slipped away, lost among the others. Her grandmother clasped her hand. "This is how we remember," she said. "Not by holding on, but by letting the light go where it must." They stayed until the last visible lantern disappeared into the dark. Then the villagers began their slow walk back through the trees, their footsteps barely louder than the rustle of leaves. Aya glanced over her shoulder once, but the lake was empty now, its surface silvered by moonlight. By the time they returned home, the candles in the dock lanterns had burned out. The air smelled faintly of wax and water. Aya sat on the veranda for a long while, listening to the lake's quiet breathing. Somewhere in the darkness, she imagined, her father was walking too across a bridge of reflected lantern light, toward a place she could not yet see. And though the night was silent, it seemed to her that something had answered, softly, from across the water. Whispers through the cypress trees. The cypress trees stood in a quiet line along the ridge, their dark needles brushing against the evening sky. Each trunk, tall and straight, seemed older than memory, its roots drinking from the same earth that had seen centuries pass. The villagers said that when the wind was right, you could hear them speak not in words, but in a voice older than any human tongue. A voice that moved through the air like the scent of rain before it falls. Aya had heard the whispers since she was a child. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the sound of wind tangled in branches, or the sigh of leaves bending to the season's weight. But as she grew older, she noticed patterns in those murmurs. Certain nights, especially near the turn of autumn, the air seemed to carry messages that settled into her bones. She could not explain them, nor could she ignore them. It was late September when she returned to her village after many years away. She had been living in the city, working in a place where the air smelled of metal and exhaust, and the sky was sliced into narrow strips by buildings. But the call to come home had been strong, and she could not say whether it was her longing or the distant voices of the cypress trees that brought her back. The path up to the ridge was the same as she remembered, a winding trail edged with moss-covered stones, the ground soft with fallen needles. The scent of the trees was sharp yet comforting, like a memory wrapped in the warmth of an old shawl. As she climbed, she passed the small shrine at the halfway point, a simple wooden structure with a weathered roof. She paused to bow, her hands pressed together, and felt the air shift, as if the trees were acknowledging her return. At the top of the ridge, the world opened. The land fell away into valleys touched by the orange light of the setting sun. Far in the distance, a river glimmered, winding through rice fields and low hills. But Aya's eyes went first to the grove itself, the cypress trunks like silent guardians, their shadows long and interwoven. She stepped between them, and the sound came immediately. It was not a rustle, not quite a sigh, but something that moved in layers, as though the air itself carried overlapping threads of memory. Aya stood still, her breath slow, letting the sounds wash over her. Beneath the wind, there was a pulse, faint, steady like the beating of a heart. Her grandmother used to say that each cypress held the voice of someone who had once loved this land. The villagers who tended the fields, the travelers who paused here to rest, the children who played along the ridges. All of them left behind something invisible, woven into the trees' long lives. The cypress remember, her grandmother had told her, but they speak only to those who will listen. Aya closed her eyes, and the voices seemed to rise. She could almost make out words, fragments of laughter, the rhythm of a lullaby, the low hum of a story told around a fire. Then, more clearly, a single phrase drifted toward her: "You are part of this." She opened her eyes and looked down the ridge toward the village. The roofs were the same, though fewer than before, their tiles catching the last light. Many had left over the years, seeking work or simply a different life. Aya herself had been one of them. Yet here, surrounded by the cypress, she felt a thread tighten, a connection she had let slacken but never sever. She stayed until the first stars appeared, and the air grew cool enough to prickle her skin. The voices grew softer, blending with the night insects and the faint rush of the river below. On the walk back down, she carried the sound with her, as if it were folded into her very breath. That night, Aya dreamed of the cypress grove. She saw herself as a child, running between the trunks, the needles falling like slow rain. She saw her grandmother sitting on the shrine's steps, sewing something from pale cloth. And in the dream, the trees leaned toward her, their branches almost touching, as though they meant to wrap her in their shadow and keep her safe. In the days that followed, Aya visited the grove each evening. She began to notice small things she had missed before, the way the bark caught the light at dusk, the shift in the scent as the air cooled, the faint silver dust of spider webs stretched between low branches. The voices changed, too. Some days they were quick and bright, like the chatter of sparrows. Other days they were deep and slow, as if the trees were thinking through centuries. One evening, a storm rolled in from the coast, heavy clouds pressing low over the hills. Aya climbed to the grove anyway, her steps quickening as the first drops began to fall. The cypress swayed under the weight of the wind, their voices rising into something wilder, more urgent. She stood at the center, rain soaking her hair, and felt the pulse again, faster now, alive with the storm. A sudden gust bent the branches, and for a moment she thought she heard her name. The sound was carried away almost instantly, but it left a warmth in her chest. It felt like a greeting, or perhaps a promise. When the storm passed, the grove dripped quietly in the fading light. Aya knelt at the base of the oldest tree, pressing her palm to the damp bark. She whispered a thank you, not knowing exactly to whom it was addressed. That night, she began writing, not letters, not a diary, but something in between. Fragments of what she heard, memories stirred by the voices, images that rose like mist from the forest floor. She left the pages on her desk by the open window, and each morning the scent of cypress seemed to seep into the paper. Weeks later, as autumn deepened and the air turned crisp, Aya realized she no longer thought of the grove as a place she visited. It had become part of her daily rhythm, its voice a thread woven into the quiet fabric of her days. The city felt far away, like a dream she had once believed in but no longer needed to return to. And on the last evening before winter's first frost, standing among the dark, wind-stirred trunks, Aya felt the voices settle into a single, steady whisper. You are home. Petals falling in silent rain. The first drops came just as Aiko stepped out from the small wooden gate of her grandmother's house. They were soft, barely more than a mist, clinging to her hair and settling on the sleeves of her light jacket. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of the last cherry blossoms. It was early April, and the petals had begun their slow descent to the ground. Aiko had returned to the village after many years away, the city's noise and urgency still lingering in her body. Her grandmother had passed away in winter, leaving behind the house Aiko once called home, along with a garden that seemed unchanged from her childhood. In the garden stood an old cherry tree, its branches sprawling like a memory that refused to fade. When she was a child, Aiko used to sit beneath that tree during the spring rains, collecting fallen petals in her small hands. Her grandmother would join her, bringing a blanket and a thermos of tea. And they would listen to the rain patter on the leaves, on the roof tiles, on the earth. Every petal has a story, her grandmother used to say. When they fall, they're whispering it to the rain. Now, standing at the edge of the garden, Aiko could hear the same whispers, though faint. The petals, heavy with moisture, drifted down like fragments of quiet dreams. She reached out her hand, catching one. Its pale pink was nearly white, the color washed away by days of rain. She walked slowly toward the old footpath leading to the river. The path was narrower than she remembered, the stones uneven and half hidden under moss. The rain grew steadier, tapping softly against the bamboo groves that flanked the way. Somewhere in the distance, a cuckoo called, its voice muted by the weather. The river came into view, a thin ribbon of silver sliding through the valley. The water moved slowly, reflecting the dim light of the overcast sky. Cherry trees lined the bank, their branches leaning over the current. Petals landed on the water's surface and were carried away, spinning lazily before vanishing downstream. Aiko sat on a low stone wall by the riverbank. She let the rain soak into her clothes, feeling its coolness against her skin. The petals drifting in the current reminded her of departures she had known, friends lost to time. Opportunities left behind, moments she had failed to hold on to. But unlike her childhood self, she now understood something her grandmother had hinted at: petals were not just symbols of endings. They were proof that something had bloomed, even if only for a brief season. The rain did not mourn the petals, it carried them gently, making room for what would grow next. A breeze rose, shaking the branches overhead. Dozens of petals broke free, swirling downward in pale spirals. The rain seemed to hush for a moment, as if listening. Aiko closed her eyes and heard her grandmother's voice, note as a clear sound, but as a warmth that settled in her chest. She stayed there until the light began to fade and the mist turned into a steady downpour. The village lights flickered on, glowing softly through the rain. When she finally stood, her hands were cold, but her steps felt lighter. Back at the house, she lit a small lantern and placed it by the window facing the cherry tree. Rain streamed down the glass, blurring the view, but she could still see petals falling, some caught on the wet grass, others disappearing into the shadows. That night, she dreamed of sitting under the cherry tree with her grandmother again. The rain was falling, and the petals drifted down between them. Her grandmother held out her hands, catching a single petal, and smiled. When Aiko woke, the rain had stopped. The garden smelled of fresh earth and the faint sweetness of blossoms. The cherry tree stood quietly, a few petals still clinging to its branches. She knew more would fall in the coming days, and then the tree would be bare. But for now, there were still petals on the grass, on the roof, floating in puddles like small boats. And as she stepped outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, touching the wet petals with light, making them glisten like a promise. Aiko knelt, picking one up. She held it gently, as if it might speak. And in that silent moment, she realized it already had. Beneath the moon's gentle veil, the first night of late autumn arrived quietly, with a wind that carried the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Aya walked along the narrow stone path leading from the village to the old temple on the hill. Above her, the moon floated like a pale pearl, its light softened by a thin veil of drifting clouds. The air felt almost weightless, as if the world were holding its breath. She had not been to the temple in nearly a decade. It was here, when she was a child, that she would follow her grandmother every month to offer incense. Back then, she never noticed how the stone steps curved like a slow river, or how the pines lining the path whispered to each other when the wind passed through. Now, each step seemed steeped in memory. The temple itself was nearly hidden behind a cluster of cedar trees, their dark trunks rising like pillars into the night sky. A single paper lantern hung near the entrance, swaying gently in the breeze. The warm glow painted the air with a golden haze, in contrast to the silver wash of moonlight everywhere else. Inside, the main hall was dim and quiet. The smell of old wood mixed with the faint scent of incense lingered in the beams. Aya knelt before the altar, placing a small bouquet of chrysanthemums she had picked earlier that day. They were the last flowers from the garden her grandmother had tended for years. Her grandmother's passing had been in spring, when the air was heavy with plum blossoms. Yet for Aya, the memory had always felt like an autumn night, cool, still, and threaded with silence. Tonight, she had come not to pray for anything, but simply to be here, in the same place her grandmother once sat, beneath the same moon. From outside, a soft rustling reached her ears. Aya rose and stepped into the temple's courtyard. The moon was slipping between the clouds again, the thin veil shifting just enough to reveal its gentle radiance. The light spilled over the garden onto the raked gravel, the stone lanterns, and the last few maple leaves clinging to the branches. One leaf let go, drifting slowly down. Aya reached out her hand, and by some quiet accident, the leaf landed in her palm. She turned it over, feeling the ridges and veins beneath her fingertips. It was brittle, already beginning to curl at the edges, but it seemed to carry a small weight of warmth. A memory returned, her grandmother's voice, low and steady, telling her, "Even the smallest thing holds the moonlight if you look closely enough." At the time, Aya thought it was just a pretty saying. Now, in the hush of the courtyard, she began to understand. The moonlight was not simply above them, it was caught in the leaf, the stones, even the cool night air. And in her, the wind picked up, drawing a sigh from the trees. Somewhere deeper in the forest, an owl called once, then again. Aya looked up at the shifting clouds. The moon slipped behind them for a long moment, and the world dimmed. Then, as if breathing in, the clouds thinned, and the light poured out once more, not sharp, not blinding, but gentle enough to reveal the quiet contours of the night. She walked slowly around the garden, her footsteps soft against the gravel. In the corner, a small pond mirrored the moon's pale face. A few ripples moved across its surface as a fish turned beneath. Watching the moon's reflection tremble, Aya felt a sudden ache, a reminder that beauty always carries the shadow of its passing. But that passing was not a loss. It was part of the same pattern that the seasons traced, that the moon followed in its endless cycle. Just as the veil of clouds shifted and returned, so did moments of light and shadow in her own life. Her grandmother's absence was not an ending, but a change in form, like the moonlight finding new places to rest. When Aya finally stepped back toward the stone path, the air had grown colder. She pulled her shawl closer and glanced over her shoulder one last time. The temple stood quiet, lantern glowing faintly, the moon above watching over it all. The wind rose again, carrying the dry scent of cedar and earth. Aya began the descent toward the village, her footsteps slow but steady. Somewhere inside her, she carried the image of the moon, that night veiled yet luminous, distant yet near, and the quiet, knowing that under its gentle light, nothing was truly lost. The path where shadows rest. The forest lay in that quiet hour between afternoon and evening, when the sun's light tilted low enough to slip through the trees like molten gold. Along a narrow trail, almost hidden under the tangle of roots and fallen leaves, Yori walked with measured steps. He had not been here in years. The path began behind the old shrine at the edge of his childhood village, and wound deep into the forest before fading into a clearing few ever visited. To the villagers, it was the path where shadows rest, a name spoken in a tone both reverent and cautious. When he was a boy, his grandmother had told him that the shadows here were not merely the absence of light. They were the quiet remnants of moments long past, footsteps, laughter, and sorrows that had sunk into the earth like rainwater and now slept beneath the trees. If one walked softly enough, she had said, they might hear the sighs of the forest remembering. Now, as Yori stepped between the leaning trunks of cedar and pine, the air shifted. It was cooler here, as though the canopy itself had drawn a deep breath to hold the day in stillness. The scents of damp moss and old bark lingered, layered with something faintly sweet, perhaps the last blossoms of wild azalea clinging to their stems before the seasons turn. The path was uneven, shaped more by time than by human intention. Stones jutted out at odd angles, and roots rose like frozen waves. He placed each step carefully, not wanting to disturb what lay beneath. A patch of sunlight filtered through and spilled across a cluster of ferns, their fronds trembling in the breeze. Just beyond, the light faded into the deep green shade, and the world seemed to contract into a hushed, self-contained space. Halfway along, Yuri paused by a bent maple. Its branches curved low, their leaves already tinged with the first hints of autumn crimson. Beneath it lay a small stone marker uninscribed, its surface softened by years of rain. His grandmother used to leave offerings here: a sprig of camellia, a pinch of rice, sometimes a single candle. No one had told him whom it honored, and perhaps that was the point. The stone was not a grave, but a place to acknowledge what could not be seen. He crouched, brushing away the moss with his fingers. The cool dampness clung to his skin. From somewhere deeper in the forest, a dove cooed softly, its call falling into the stillness like a pebble into water. For a moment, Yuri felt that if he remained here long enough, the shadows themselves might lean forward and speak. The trail narrowed, pressing him between two steep banks lined with ferns. The light above dimmed, and the air took on that peculiar blue-gray tone that comes just before dusk. It reminded him of evenings when he had followed his grandmother home, the smell of miso soup. Already drifting from their kitchen, the world outside folding into itself. Then, as the path curved, he saw it: the clearing. It was smaller than he remembered. At its center stood a weathered stone lantern, leaning slightly as if bowing. Around it, wild grasses swayed, and a ring of slender birch trees caught the fading light, their white bark luminous against the dark. The ground was carpeted with leaves, some freshly fallen, others from years past, their edges curling inward. Yuri stepped into the clearing. The hush here was deeper, as though the air itself had weight. He sat beside the lantern, resting his back against its cool surface. From this angle, he could see the sky through the birch branches, pale gold giving way to the soft violet of evening. The first star appeared, trembling faintly. He remembered the last time he had come, still a boy, following his grandmother's slow steps. She had told him, when the day ends, even the shadows need a place to sleep. This is where they come. He had laughed then, thinking it only a story. But sitting here now, he understood. The clearing was not empty, it was full, but in a way that could not be measured. It held the traces of all who had come before, the unspoken words, the pauses between breaths. A breeze moved through the birches, and their leaves whispered in unison. It was a sound without urgency, a rhythm too slow for any clock. Yuri closed his eyes, letting it pass through him. Somewhere in that sound, he thought he heard his grandmother's voice, low, warm, telling him again to walk softly. The sky deepened into indigo. Fireflies rose from the grasses, drifting like fragments of a dream. Their lights blinked in unsteady harmony, as if the forest itself were exhaling tiny sparks. When Yuri finally stood, the shadows had grown long, pooling at the edges of the clearing. He touched the lantern one last time, its stone holding the day's last warmth, and turned back to the path. The way home would be darker now, but he felt no unease. The shadows here were not to be feared, they had found their rest. And perhaps, in some quiet way, so had he. Breath of the evening garden. The garden lay in the deep hush of twilight, poised between the day's final glow and the night's first whisper. A faint breeze threaded through the camellia hedge, carrying with it the mingled scents of damp earth, faded wisteria, and the last white blooms of the season. It was the hour when colors softened into memory and shadows stretched long, folding the ground in their cool embrace. Akiko paused at the stone gate, fingers brushing over the weathered wood of its latch. She had walked this path countless times in her youth, yet tonight, each step felt deliberate, as though she were crossing an invisible boundary into another time. Beyond the gate, the winding stone path glimmered faintly, worn smooth by decades of silent footsteps. It curved like a quiet stream toward the heart of the garden, where a small pond lay still, holding the fading light in its surface. She had not returned to her family's old home in over 20 years. After her grandmother passed, the house had stood empty, the garden left to its rhythms. But a letter unexpected, unsigned had arrived the week before, written in a hand she thought she recognized come at dusk. The garden waits. There was no name, no explanation. Only that single line. As Akiko stepped inside, the air shifted. The faintest trace of incense lingered, as though someone had passed through moments before. Moss-covered stepping stones led her between clusters of tall irises, their purple petals heavy with the moisture of the day's heat. The sound of the world beyond the road, the faint hum of the village faded until only the murmur of wind in the bamboo remained. She stopped at the old maple tree. In her childhood, it had been the centerpiece of every autumn, flaring red before dropping its leaves in a soft spiral. Now its branches arched like the ribs of a great fan, silhouetted against the lavender sky. Beneath it sat the weathered wooden bench where her grandmother used to wait for her, hands folded over a steaming cup of tea. The bench was empty, but a small teacup rested there, half full. Steam curled upward, vanishing into the cooling air. Akiko's breath caught. She reached for the cup but hesitated. Its warmth told her it had been placed there minutes ago. She glanced around, but no one stood in the deepening shadows. The garden was not abandoned after all. It was watching her. The path carried her onward, toward the pond at the center. Lotus leaves floated like scattered coins, their round forms dark against the silver reflection of the sky. In the still water, she saw not only her face but a faint overlay of Anothera, woman older, with serene eyes and hair pinned in the style her grandmother favored. The image wavered, then dissolved as a ripple crossed the surface. She knelt by the pond's edge, fingers grazing the water. A voice rose within her memory, clear despite the years. The evening garden breathes differently, her grandmother once told her. It exhales all it has seen during the day, every footstep, every shadow, every whisper. If you are quiet, you might hear what it remembers. Akiko closed her eyes. The air was thick with the scent of pine and jasmine. Beneath the distant sound of a night bird, she heard something else soft, like a sigh. Words seemed to form inside that sound, not spoken aloud, but carried in the breath of the place itself. She could not catch all of them, only fragments. Welcome back, do you remember? And she did remember the way the lanterns once glowed like small moons on summer nights. The feel of her grandmother's hand steadying her across the stepping stones, the quiet talks under the plum tree after rain. When she opened her eyes, the lanterns along the path were lit. No one had been there to light them. Their paper shades trembled in the breeze, casting small ripples of gold across the moss. She rose, following their glow deeper into the garden until she reached the far edge, where the plum tree still stood. Its blossoms were long gone, replaced by the first pale fruit of the season. Beneath it was the stone basin where her grandmother had taught her to wash her hands before entering the tea house. A dipper rested there now, filled with fresh water that mirrored the deepening blue of the sky. She felt the weight of time in her chest, how much had been lost, and yet how much remained, hidden in the folds of the evening. Kneeling, she washed her hands as she had been taught. The water was cool, carrying with it a faint trace of the past. From the shadows beyond the tea house, a figure emerged. The same serene eyes, the same pinned hair. Not quite solid, not entirely light like the last line of a fading dream. The figure inclined her head, a small smile crossing her lips. No words were spoken, none were needed. Akiko understood the garden had kept its breath for her, holding it all these years, and now it exhaled its welcome. The figure stepped back into the dimness and was gone. Akiko lingered until the stars came out, the air heavy with the garden's gentle breathing. When she finally left, the scent of jasmine followed her, and in her heart. The steady rhythm of a place that had been waiting patiently, quietly for her return.